Under the effects of forbidden herbs deliberately slipped into her cup, she gave herself to a stranger that night and woke up disgraced, now carrying a child whose father she could not remember. Rejected by all, no one dares to even come near her. When an arranged marriage threatens to seal the Alpha King's fate forever, the unthinkable happens. He steps closer to her and whispers, "Pretend your baby is mine." Barbara could not remember exactly when the room had begun to tilt beneath her feet. Maybe it was when the second chalice of spiced wine appeared in her hand, though she could not recall accepting it, or when the torches along the corridor walls began to blur into streams of gold, melting like honey against the stone. She blinked slowly, trying to anchor her gaze on something real, something solid, but everything seemed softened, heated, impossibly far away. The Alpha Council gathering had been grand, full of music and political maneuvering, nobles circling one another like wolves assessing weakness. Barbara had been careful, so careful, to mind her manners and guard her tongue. But now her tongue felt thick, her limbs heavy as wet velvet. The faces around her stretched and warped like reflections in troubled water. "Are you unwell, Lady Barbara?" A voice, familiar, yet she could not place it. A hand on her elbow, guiding her away from the crowd. She tried to answer, but the words tangled before they reached her lips. The corridor tilted. She stumbled, caught herself against cold stone that felt strangely alive beneath her palm. Then there were different hands, larger, steadier, catching her before she fell. A voice, deep and resonant, cutting through the haze. "I have you." She looked up but could see only shadows and the suggestion of a face, strong-featured and solemn. The scent of leather and something wild, like winter storms and pine forests. His presence felt like shelter, like danger, like destiny colliding with her in a hallway she would not remember come morning. What happened next existed only in fragments, the sensation of being carried, of whispered words she could not quite hear, of warmth and connection so profound it felt like her soul had recognized something her mind could not name. And then, nothing. Darkness. Oblivion. When Barbara woke, it was in an unfamiliar chamber with sunlight piercing her skull like accusations. Her body ached in ways that told a story her memory refused to confirm. The hours that followed were a nightmare of slow realization. The mark on her neck, the tenderness of her skin, the knowledge that something irrevocable had occurred while she lay trapped in chemical twilight. Weeks passed, then months, and with them came the unmistakable truth growing inside her body. A child conceived in a night stolen from her, by a man whose face she could not recall. Her family's reaction was swift and merciless. The word disgrace became her new name. Doors that once opened to her now slammed shut. Invitations ceased. Former friends crossed the street to avoid her path. Barbara, once a respected daughter of a noble house, became the woman no one wanted. Ruined, shameful, carrying the evidence of her supposed sin visible for all to see. Now, 8 months later, she stands in a grand hall that feels more like an execution chamber. Her father has dressed her in pale silk that flows over her swollen belly, a gown that hides nothing and declares everything. This is her final chance, he told her, with barely concealed disgust. The king's banquet, where perhaps some minor lord, desperate for a dowry, or pitying enough to overlook scandal, might claim her and the bastard she carries. The nobles whisper behind jeweled fans, their eyes slide over her and away, as if looking directly at her might contaminate them. Barbara keeps her chin up through sheer stubbornness, her hand resting protectively on her belly, feeling her child move beneath her palm. She has learned to armor herself in silence, to let their judgment roll off her like rain. But tonight, the weight of their contempt feels crushing. Across the vast hall, standing among the council elders who gesture and argue in urgent whispers, is Alpha King Robert. He is magnificent in battle-worn armor polished to ceremony, his dark hair falling past his shoulders, his profile sharp and uncompromising. The council has been pressuring him for months to choose a bride, to secure the succession, to stop delaying duty for the sake of some phantom memory he cannot release. Robert's jaw is tight with barely leashed frustration. His dark eyes scan the crowd of preening noblewomen, each one positioned to catch his attention, each one offered up like tribute. His gaze moves across them without pause, until it stops, until it lands on the one woman every other person in the room is pretending not to see. Barbara feels the weight of his stare like a physical touch. She looks up, meets those piercing eyes across the distance of the crowded hall, and something inside her chest tightens with recognition she cannot explain. The Alpha King sets down his wine. He steps forward, away from the council members who reach for his arm to stop him. The crowd parts as he walks, not because they wish to honor him, but because one does not stand in the path of a predator who has chosen his direction. He walks straight toward the disgraced pregnant woman, standing alone against the pillar. The hall falls silent. Even the musicians cease their playing. Every eye turns to watch the impossible unfold. Robert stops before Barbara, close enough that she must tilt her head back to meet his gaze. Up close, she can see the weariness etched at the corners of his eyes, the scars that mark his hands where they rest on his sword belt, the way he looks at her as if trying to solve a puzzle written in a language he has forgotten. He leans down, his voice pitched for her ears alone, and speaks 5 words that will change both their fates forever. Pretend your baby is mine. Chapter 1. Barbara's reflection in the polished mirror showed a woman she barely recognized. The pale silk gown her father had commissioned, spending coin he could ill afford, draped elegantly over her swollen belly, the fabric shimmering in the candlelight like moonlight on water. It was beautiful. It was also a banner announcing her shame to every person who would see her tonight. "Stand straighter," her father barked from the doorway, his face carved from disappointment and barely suppressed rage. "If you must parade your disgrace, at least do it with some dignity. Perhaps a minor lord will take pity on you. Perhaps someone will be desperate enough for your dowry to overlook the bastard." Barbara said nothing. She had learned months ago that silence was her only shield against his words. She placed her hand protectively over her belly, feeling the child within shift and turn, blissfully unaware of the world's judgment waiting beyond the womb. The king's banquet hall was a cathedral of excess. Vaulted ceilings painted with scenes of ancient victories, chandeliers dripping with crystal that caught the light of 1,000 candles, tables laden with delicacies from across the kingdom. The nobles moved through it like brightly colored fish in gilded water, their laughter sharp as broken glass. Barbara stood against a marble pillar near the edge of the hall, positioned where she could be seen, but easily ignored. Her father had abandoned her almost immediately to join the other lords, leaving her alone in the crowd. She felt the weight of their stares like physical blows, the quickly averted eyes, the whispered conversations behind raised hands, the way people created distance around her as if her disgrace might be contagious. A group of young noblewomen passed close enough for Barbara to hear their voices. 8 months along and still no husband. How shameless. I heard she doesn't even know who the father is. My mother says she was always too proud. This is what pride gets you. Barbara's fingers tightened on her belly. She kept her expression carefully neutral. her eyes fixed on some distant point, willing herself to become invisible. Across the hall, elevated on the dais where the royal table commanded the room, Alpha King Robert sat like a caged wolf, his armor, ceremonial but clearly battle-worn, with scrollwork covering old dents and scratches, caught the candlelight as he shifted restlessly. Council members flanked him on either side, gesturing urgently, while eligible noblewomen positioned themselves in his line of sight, each one draped in silk and ambition. Barbara watched without meaning to, drawn by something she couldn't name. Even from this distance, she could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hand gripped his wine goblet, as if imagining it was something else entirely. His dark eyes scanned the room with predatory assessment, moving over the preening crowds with clear disinterest. Then his gaze stopped, locked, fixed directly on her. Barbara's breath caught. For a moment that stretched impossibly long, the Alpha King stared at the one woman in the room everyone else was trying not to see. His expression shifted. Confusion, recognition, something deeper and more primal that made her heart pound against her ribs. He stood. The council members reached for him, voices rising in protest, but Robert was already moving, his eyes never leaving hers as he descended from the dais and began to walk through the crowd. Toward her. Chapter 2. The crowd parted before Robert like water before the prow of a ship. Nobles stumbling over themselves to clear his path. Barbara watched him approach, her heart hammering so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. This close, she could see details the distance had hidden, the fine lines of exhaustion carved around his eyes, the pale scar that traced his jawline and disappeared beneath his collar, the way his scarred hands rested with unconscious readiness near his sword. He stopped directly before her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. The noise of the hall seemed to fade, replaced by the rushing of blood in her ears. His eyes searched her face with an intensity that made her feel stripped bare, as if he were looking for something he'd lost and half believed he'd found. "What is your name?" His voice was low, meant only for her. "Barbara, Your Majesty." Her own voice came out steadier than she'd expected. Something flickered in his expression. Recognition. Confusion, gone too quickly to identify. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear, and spoke 5 words that stopped her heart. "Pretend your baby is mine." Barbara's mind went blank. She opened her mouth to respond, to ask if she'd heard correctly. But Robert was already straightening, already turning to face the hall. His hand, large, warm, bearing the calluses of a warrior, closed gently around hers. His voice, when he spoke, carried across the suddenly silent hall with the absolute authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "The child Lady Barbara carries is mine. I claim both mother and child under my protection. Let no one in this kingdom question their legitimacy or their place." The explosion of sound was immediate and deafening. Gasps rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. Council members surged forward, their faces purple with shock and outrage. Barbara's father stood frozen, his wine goblet suspended halfway to his lips. The noblewomen who had been competing for Robert's attention looked as if they'd been struck. "Your Majesty, this is impossible," one council member began. "You cannot simply claim," another sputtered. "The succession requires—" Robert's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "I have spoken. My word is law. Or have the years of peace made you forget that?" The threat beneath the courtesy was unmistakable. The council members fell silent, though their faces promised this conversation was far from over. Barbara stood frozen in the center of the storm, Robert's hand still wrapped around hers, her entire world tilting on its axis. The nobles who had avoided her gaze now stared openly. their expressions ranging from shock to calculation to barely concealed fury. Hours later, in a private chamber away from the chaos, Robert paced like the wolf he resembled. Barbara sat in a chair he'd offered, her hands folded protectively over her belly, watching him with wary confusion. "I need time," he said finally, stopping to face her. "The council has been pressuring me to marry, to produce an heir. They've arranged unions, paraded eligible women before me like livestock at market. But I cannot." He ran a hand through his dark hair, frustration evident in every line of his body. "There was a night, 8 months ago. I was drugged. Moon herbs, they call them. I remember fragments. A woman, her touch, the feeling that I'd found something essential, but I cannot remember her face." Barbara's breath caught. 8 months ago. Moon herbs, fragments of memory. "I've been searching for her ever since," Robert continued, not noticing her reaction. "But the council won't wait. They demand I choose a bride, produce a legitimate heir. Your appearance tonight, it solves both our problems. I claim your child as my own, which satisfies their demands for now. In return, you and your baby receive legitimacy, protection, a place in the castle. It buys me time to find the woman I'm searching for." "And when you find her," Barbara's voice was barely a whisper, "then we'll decide what comes next. But for now, we help each other survive." He moved closer, his eyes searching hers with that same inexplicable intensity. "Do you accept?" Barbara looked at this warrior king who offered salvation with one hand while searching for a ghost with the other. Something in his presence called to parts of her she'd thought long dead. She thought of her child, of the life of shame that awaited them both if she refused. "I accept," she said, and sealed both their fates. Chapter 3. The chambers assigned to Barbara were more beautiful than anything she had ever imagined, let alone inhabited. Silk canopies in deep crimson draped over a bed, large enough for 4 people, their fabric whispering with every breath of air. Marble floors gleamed like still water, covered here and there with carpets so thick her feet sank into them. The windows, tall as 2 men standing, overlooked the entire kingdom, the city spreading below like a tapestry of rooftops and spires, the forests beyond fading into blue distance. A doorway connected her chambers to a shared sitting room, which in turn connected to Robert's private quarters. The arrangement was intimate in theory, a chasm in practice. "Lady Barbara." The council elder's voice dripped with false courtesy as he passed her in the corridor outside the royal wing. "How fortunate that you find yourself in such elevated circumstances." His eyes traveled deliberately to her belly, his meaning clear. Enjoy it while it lasts. She had been in the castle 3 days and already understood the landscape. The servants were efficient but cold, performing their duties with mechanical precision while their eyes held judgment. The courtiers who once wouldn't spare her a glance now watched her constantly, cataloguing her every movement, every word, searching for evidence of whatever deception they were certain she was perpetrating. "The king's temporary fancy," she'd heard one lady-in-waiting whisper to another as Barbara passed. "Once he finds his mystery woman, this one will be cast aside faster than yesterday's flowers." Only Marcus, Robert's closest advisor, treated her differently. He was a tall man with graying temples and eyes that missed nothing, yet when he looked at Barbara, she saw curiosity rather than contempt, assessment rather than dismissal. "The king chose you for a reason," Marcus had said quietly one afternoon, finding her alone in the sitting room. "He does nothing without purpose. Perhaps you should trust that." "Even if the purpose is temporary?" Barbara asked. Marcus's expression had softened almost imperceptibly. Even then, temporary protection is better than none at all. Robert himself remained an enigma. He was courteous when they crossed paths, inquiring after her comfort and her health with the careful politeness of a host to an unexpected guest. But there was a distance in his manner, as if he were keeping himself deliberately separate from the arrangement he'd created. Yet sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, Barbara would catch him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. Not cold assessment or distant courtesy, but something deeper, more troubled, as if he were trying to solve an equation written in a language he'd once known but had forgotten. Those moments never lasted. He would blink, the expression would vanish, and the courteous stranger would return. Now, as midnight approached and the castle settled into silence, Barbara lay in her vast bed, with one hand resting on her belly, feeling her child shift and turn. The baby seemed restless tonight, perhaps sensing her mother's unsettled thoughts. She had escaped one prison, her father's house, where shame followed her like a shadow. But had she merely traded it for another? These beautiful chambers felt gilded but no less confining. The noble's contempt was more polished here, but no less cutting. And Robert, the man who had saved her with 5 impossible words, remained as unreachable as the stars beyond her window. Her child moved again, a flutter against her palm. Barbara closed her eyes and whispered into the darkness, "I will keep you safe, whatever it costs me, I promise." Outside, in the sitting room that connected their chambers, a shadow moved. Robert stood at his own doorway, listening to words he was never meant to hear. His hand pressed against his chest, where his heart beat with unexplained urgency. Chapter 4. Sleep would not come. Barbara lay in her bed for hours, watching moonlight paint silver patterns across the marble floor, feeling her child turn restlessly inside her, as if sharing her mother's disquiet. Finally, she rose and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, padding barefoot through the silent chambers, toward the gardens she had glimpsed from her windows. The night air was cool against her skin, carrying the heavy sweetness of jasmine that grew wild near the fountain. Barbara followed the scent like a lifeline, her feet finding the smooth stone paths by moonlight. The garden was a different world at night, shadows and silver, the whisper of leaves, the musical splash of water over stone. She was not alone. Robert sat on a stone bench near the fountain, his head bowed, his shoulders carrying a weight that seemed visible in the moonlight. Without his armor and formal attire, dressed only in a simple shirt and dark trousers, he looked less like the Alpha King and more like a man who had forgotten how to rest. Barbara hesitated, one hand instinctively moving to her belly. She should leave, return to her chambers, respect his privacy. But something in his posture, the loneliness of it, made her feet move forward instead. "Your Majesty." He looked up, surprise flickering across his face before settling into something softer. "Barbara, you cannot sleep either. The baby is restless tonight." She gestured to the bench. "May I?" "Please." They sat in silence for a long moment, the fountain providing a gentle accompaniment to the night. The jasmine was stronger here, almost overwhelming in its sweetness. "I come here when the castle feels too confining," Robert said finally. "When the council's demands and the courtier's expectations become too much. Here, I can simply be. I understand that feeling." Barbara's voice was quiet, "Though I suspect for different reasons." Perhaps not so different. He turned to look at her, and in the moonlight, his face held an openness she had never seen in daylight. "You think I do not notice how they treat you. The whispers, the contempt barely disguised as courtesy. I may be king, but I cannot command hearts or tongues. You gave me sanctuary when I had none. The rest I can endure." Robert's expression tightened with something that looked like pain. "You should not have to endure it. You should—" He trailed off, his hand unconsciously moving to press against his chest. "There was a night, 8 months ago. I told you I was drugged, but I did not tell you everything." Barbara's heart began to race. "What do you mean?" "I remember fragments, sensations more than images, the hallway spinning, the ground unsteady beneath my feet. Someone guided me, but I cannot recall who. Then there were different hands, smaller, gentler. A voice, frightened at first. Then—" He paused, his eyes distant with memory. "It felt like coming home, like finding something essential I did not know I had been missing." Barbara could barely breathe. The moonlight, the jasmine, the fountain, everything blurred at the edges. "I remember softness," Robert continued, his voice dropping lower. "The sound of breathing that changed from frightened to something else. A scent, jasmine, like here, but mixed with something uniquely hers, something I would know anywhere if I could just—" He shook his head in frustration. "But her face remains hidden. Every time I try to recall it, the memory slips away like water through my fingers." "Perhaps," Barbara whispered, her throat tight. "She cannot remember either. Perhaps she was drugged as well, and what you experienced, she experienced too. And neither of you can find each other because you are both searching for ghosts." Robert looked at her sharply, something kindling in his eyes. "You think so?" "I think moon herbs steal more than consent. They steal certainty. They steal truth." Her hand trembled against her belly. They sat in silence, the weight of unspoken possibilities hanging between them like the jasmine-scented air. Robert's gaze lingered on her face, searching, always searching, while Barbara fought the urge to tell him everything. Or perhaps she fought the fear that her fragmented memories might be wishful thinking rather than truth. "Will you come here again?" Robert asked finally. "Tomorrow night?" "Yes," Barbara said, and knew she was agreeing to far more than another conversation in the garden. Chapter 5. The formal dinner was an exercise in calculated humiliation disguised as honor. Barbara sat at the high table, positioned beside Robert as protocol demanded, while dozens of noble families watched with expressions ranging from fascination to outrage. The gown the royal seamstress had provided was exquisite, deep emerald silk that somehow made her pregnancy look regal rather than shameful. But it did nothing to shield her from the weight of judgment pressing down from all sides. Eleanor sat 3 places down, a vision in midnight blue with diamonds glittering at her throat. She was beautiful in the way of sharp things, angular features, calculating eyes, a smile that never quite reached beyond her lips. Barbara had learned her name and history from a sympathetic servant. Lady Eleanor had pursued Robert for years, certain she would eventually wear him down and claim the crown. Lady Barbara. Elena's voice carried clearly across the table during a lull in conversation. "You must tell us about your family. I confess I know so little about your background." The emphasis on the last word was delicate as a knife between ribs. Barbara met her gaze steadily. "My family serves the kingdom with honor, as they have for generations. Of course, though circumstances can change so quickly, can they not? One day a simple noblewoman, the next." Elena's smile sharpened. "Well, here you are." Robert's hand tightened on his goblet, but before he could speak, a servant stumbled near Elena, sending wine cascading across the white tablecloth. The commotion was immediate. Servants rushing forward, guests exclaiming, nobles rising from their seats. In the chaos, Barbara saw Elena's hand move with practiced precision, switching Robert's cup with another from a passing tray. The motion was so smooth, so quick, that Barbara almost convinced herself she had imagined it. The dinner continued, courses appearing and disappearing, while conversation flowed around Barbara like water around stone. But something had changed. Robert's responses grew slower, his gaze unfocused. When he reached for his wine again, his hand trembled slightly. "Your Majesty?" Barbara leaned closer, keeping her voice low. "Are you unwell?" Robert's eyes found hers, and she saw his pupils were dilated, his breathing shallow. "The room is warm." As the dinner concluded and guests rose to mingle, Robert stood too quickly and swayed. Barbara reached out instinctively, her hand closing around his forearm to steady him. The moment her skin touched his, Robert went utterly still. His free hand came up to cover hers, pressing her palm against his arm as if confirming something impossible. His eyes widened, pupils blown dark, and his breathing quickened. "Your hand," he whispered, his voice rough. "I know your hand." "Robert, I remember this. The way your fingers—" He pulled her closer, his other hand coming up to cup her face, thumb tracing her cheekbone with devastating gentleness. How did I not see it? How did I not know? Barbara's heart hammered against her ribs. Around them, conversations died as nobles turned to watch. Elena's face had gone pale, her calculated composure cracking. Then something shifted in Robert's expression, confusion flooding in where certainty had been. He released Barbara abruptly, stumbling back a step. Forgive me. I don't know what." His hand pressed against his temple, his face contorting with effort. The wine. Something in the wine. Marcus appeared at his elbow, steady and calm. "Your Majesty, perhaps you should retire." Robert allowed himself to be guided away, but his eyes found Barbara once more before he left, searching her face with desperate confusion, as if she held answers to questions he could not articulate. Elena rose smoothly from her seat, her smile restored, but brittle at the edges. She approached Barbara with the grace of a predator circling prey. "How remarkable," she said softly, for Barbara's ears alone. "The king seems quite affected by your presence. One wonders what other secrets you might be keeping." Barbara met her gaze without flinching, one hand protective on her belly. "I keep no secrets, Lady Elena, only truths that have not yet been spoken." Chapter 6. The council chamber was suffocating despite its vast proportions. Barbara stood near the doorway where Marcus had positioned her, present, but not seated, acknowledged, but not included, while the council elders debated her existence as if she were a ledger entry to be questioned and verified. "The timeline is suspicious at best," Elder Thomas declared, his jowls quivering with indignation. "The king claims the child, yet there is no record of any relationship between them before her." Condition became apparent. "Are you suggesting His Majesty lies?" Robert's voice was dangerously quiet. "I am suggesting, Your Majesty, that the succession requires certainty. If this child is truly yours, then we must have proof beyond mere proclamation." "My word is not sufficient?" Robert rose from his seat, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "I claimed her. I claimed the child. That is all the proof you require. With respect, Your Majesty, the kingdom deserves a king who honors his responsibilities, which is precisely what I am doing." Robert's hands pressed flat against the table, his knuckles white. "Lady Barbara carries my heir. Anyone who questions this questions me. Are we clear?" The silence that followed was thick with resentment, but no one dared challenge him further. Barbara stood frozen, torn between gratitude and the humiliation of being defended like property, whose ownership was in dispute. Later, in the privacy of their shared sitting room, the careful distance they had maintained shattered like glass. "You did not need to do that," Barbara said, her voice tight. "Did you expect me to let them tear you apart? I expected nothing. That is the problem, Robert. I am a convenience to you, a solution to a political problem, and yet you defend me as if—" She stopped, her hands clenching in the fabric of her gown. "As if I matter beyond the arrangement we made. You think you do not matter?" Robert's voice was low, dangerous in a different way than it had been in the council chamber. "I think I am a placeholder, a temporary measure until you find your ghost, your mystery woman, the one you actually want." The words came out harder than she intended, months of uncertainty and loneliness sharpening them to blades. "I am tired of being talked about as if I am not in the room. Tired of the pretense. If this is only temporary, then say so. Stop looking at me the way you do. Stop making me feel—" "Feel what?" Robert moved closer, his eyes blazing. "What do I make you feel, Barbara? Like I matter. Like you see me, not just a solution to your problem, but I know better. I know I am not her, not the woman you remember, not her." Robert's laugh was bitter. "You are so certain of that. Your memories are of someone else. Someone perfect. Someone you built into a fantasy, while you what? Stand here in front of me, real and impossible, and driving me mad because I cannot understand why every instinct I possess is screaming that you are exactly who I have been searching for." The words hung between them like lightning, waiting to strike. Barbara's breath caught, her heart racing so hard she felt dizzy. Robert stared at her, his chest heaving, looking as shocked by his own admission as she felt. "Robert," he moved. 2 strides crossed the distance between them, and then his hands were cradling her face, and his mouth was on hers, kissing her with a desperation that bordered on violence. Not gentle, not careful, but consuming, a drowning man finding air. Barbara's mind went blank. Her body responded before thought could intervene, her hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer despite the swell of her belly between them. The kiss was recognition and revelation, every nerve ending in her body suddenly alive with the certainty that this was right. This was real. This was memory, fragmented but undeniable. His mouth, his taste, the way his hand cupped the back of her neck. She had felt this before, known this before, been consumed by this before in a night. Her mind could not quite grasp, but her body had never forgotten. Robert made a sound against her mouth, half groan, half revelation. His hands slid from her face to her shoulders, down her arms, as if mapping territory his skin remembered, even if his mind struggled to catch up. When he finally broke the kiss, they were both breathing hard, foreheads pressed together, the world reduced to the space between their bodies and the thundering of 2 hearts finding the same rhythm. "It's you," Robert whispered, his voice raw with wonder and something that sounded like grief. "All this time. It's you." A sharp knock shattered the moment. "Your Majesty!" Marcus's voice was urgent through the door. "Urgent news from the northern border. The council demands your presence immediately." Robert closed his eyes, his jaw clenching. His hands tightened on Barbara's arms for one more heartbeat before he stepped back, leaving her cold and bereft. "We are not finished," he said, his eyes burning into hers with promise and need. Then he was gone, and Barbara stood alone, her lips still burning, her heart finally understanding what her mind had been too frightened to believe. Chapter 7. In a chamber far from the royal wing, where shadows gathered thick and candlelight struggled to reach the corners. 3 figures bent their heads together in conspiracy. "He is too attached to her already," Elena hissed, her beautiful face twisted with something ugly in the flickering light. "Did you see how he kissed her? How he looks at her? If we wait much longer, he will be lost to us entirely." Elder Thomas leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. The king's infatuation is indeed problematic. But we must be careful. Robert is not a fool, and Marcus watches everything. Then we must act before they can prevent it. The third voice belonged to Barbara's uncle, Lord William, whose resentment had been festering since his niece's elevation. "She has made our family a laughingstock. First the disgrace, now this obscene rise to power. It is unnatural, unearned." "It is more than unearned," Thomas said coldly. "It is dangerous. If she produces a son, if that child is recognized as heir, the succession becomes complicated. My own interests in the throne become difficult." Elena's eyes glittered, which is why she cannot give birth. A tragedy during delivery. Such things happen all the time, especially with bastard children conceived in scandal. The king will grieve, of course, but grief fades, and when it does, I will be there to comfort him, to offer him what he truly needs: a proper queen, legitimate heirs, and the convenient fiction that I was the woman from his lost night all along. "You expect him to believe that?" William asked skeptically. "Men believe what they want to believe, especially when the alternative is too painful. With Barbara gone and the child with her, who can prove otherwise? I know enough details from sources to make my claim believable. And unlike Barbara, I will not be too dead to confirm the story." Thomas nodded slowly. "The plan has merit, but the execution must be flawless. It must look like an accident. Complications during childbirth. Perhaps the healers were too far away. Tragic, but unavoidable. I have guards who can be bought," Elena said, "and servants who owe me favors. We take her during one of her garden walks. She goes there nearly every afternoon now, always at the same time. We move her to a location outside the castle, somewhere remote. When her labor begins, and at 9 months it will begin soon, nature will take its course, with a little help to ensure the proper outcome. And if Robert searches for her, he will search, but by the time he finds her, it will be too late. A woman dead in childbirth, the baby lost with her. Tragic, unavoidable. The king's grief will be genuine, which will make it all the more convincing." The conspiracy spread like poison through the castle's veins. Guards were approached with heavy purses and heavier threats. Servants found themselves indebted to Lady Elena in ways they could not refuse. Messages were forged, schedules were obtained, and the trap was carefully, methodically set. Marcus noticed the inconsistencies first. A guard posted where none should be, a servant asking questions about Barbara's routines, the way certain council members had grown quiet and watchful. He brought his concerns to Robert in the early hours before dawn, finding the king already awake, standing at his window overlooking the gardens where Barbara walked each day. "Something is wrong," Marcus said without preamble. "I cannot identify the threat, but it is there. The pattern is too deliberate to be coincidence." Robert turned from the window, his face drawn. "Barbara, I believe so. The questions, the movements, they all center around her schedule, her habits." Marcus's expression was grim. "We should increase her guard, keep her confined to the royal wing, until we can identify." "She will not accept confinement, not after everything she has endured." Robert's jaw clenched. "But you are right. double the guards on her chambers, have someone watch the gardens, and Marcus. His eyes met his advisor's with lethal intensity. Find out who is behind this, whatever it takes. But even as Marcus nodded and left to implement the new security measures, both men knew the truth that neither wanted to speak aloud. A threat they could not name was nearly impossible to stop. And Barbara, heavy with child and trusting in the sanctuary Robert had provided, had no idea that the web was already tightening around her, waiting only for the perfect moment to snap closed. Chapter 8. The afternoon was perfect. Sun warming the garden stones, jasmine heavy in the air, the fountain's music accompanying Barbara's slow walk along the familiar paths. 2 guards flanked her at a respectful distance, their presence meant to be reassuring. She did not notice when they exchanged glances or when one of them nodded to someone hidden in the hedgerows. The explosion came from the east wall, not large enough to cause real damage, but loud enough to draw attention, to create chaos. Barbara turned toward the sound, her hand instinctively protecting her belly. In that moment of distraction, rough hands seized her from behind. A cloth pressed over her mouth, sickeningly sweet with chemicals. She struggled, but her pregnant body was slow, unwieldy. The world tilted and darkened. When awareness returned, she was moving, carried through narrow passages she had never seen, stone walls pressing close, the air damp and cold. Then sunlight, blinding after the darkness, and the jarring motion of a cart over rough roads. By the time the effects of the drug wore off completely, the castle had vanished behind miles of dense forest. The abandoned hunting lodge materialized from the trees like something from a nightmare, walls crumbling, roof sagging, windows dark as empty eye sockets. They dragged her inside, her captors' faces hidden behind cloth masks. One of them, his voice familiar in a way that made her stomach turn, spoke quietly to the others. Keep her here. When the labor starts, you know what to do. But nature had its own timeline. As darkness fell and the forest sounds grew loud around the lodge, Barbara felt the first contraction. Not the gentle practice pains she had been feeling for weeks, but something fierce and unmistakable. Her water broke, soaking through her gown, and the reality of her situation crashed over her with the force of a breaking wave. She was going to give birth here, alone, with people who intended for neither her nor her child to survive. Terror gave way to something harder, colder. Barbara had survived disgrace, survived months of shame and isolation, survived being used as a political pawn. She would survive this too. She had to. For her child. At the castle, Robert stood in the empty garden, his face carved from stone and fury. How long? 20 minutes since the explosion, Marcus said, his voice tight. The guards who were with her are dead. Throats cut. Professional work. Which direction? North, toward the old hunting grounds. Marcus hesitated. Robert, she could be anywhere by now. And if she goes into labor, then we find her before that happens. Robert was already moving toward the stables, Marcus and 6 of his most trusted warriors falling into step behind him. Get the tracking hounds. Now. They rode through the afternoon and into the gathering dusk, following the trail the hounds had picked up from Barbara's discarded shawl. Robert pushed them mercilessly, his mind focused with the crystalline clarity of combat. Every skill he had honed over years of warfare came flooding back, the ability to read tracks, to anticipate movement, to think like his enemy. But beneath the tactical thinking ran something more primal, the bond he had been denying, the connection he had tried to rationalize as political convenience, now screamed through every fiber of his being. Barbara was his mate, The woman he had been searching for had been beside him all along, and he had been too blind, too stubborn, too trapped in his own certainty to see it. "If she dies," he said to Marcus as they rode, his voice raw, "I will burn the kingdom to find everyone responsible." "She will not die," Marcus said, with a certainty he did not feel. "Barbara is stronger than anyone gives her credit for." The hunting lodge appeared as full darkness fell, candlelight flickering in the broken windows. Robert signaled for silence, his warriors spreading out to surround the structure. Through the gaps in the walls, he could hear voices, panic, confusion, and beneath it all, a sound that stopped his heart. Barbara's voice, raw with pain and defiance. "Stay back. Touch me again, and I swear I will." Her words dissolved into a cry that was part pain, part rage. Robert kicked in the door with enough force to tear it from its hinges. The scene inside was chaos. Two captors backing away from Barbara, who had somehow armed herself with a broken chair leg. Her face streaked with sweat and tears, her body clearly in the throes of active labor. One captor lay unconscious on the floor, blood streaming from his temple. The men tried to run. They did not make it 3 steps before Robert's warriors had them pinned, blades at their throats. Robert crossed the room in 2 strides, falling to his knees beside Barbara as another contraction seized her. "I have you," he said, his hands cradling her face. "I am here. You are safe." "Robert." Her fingers dug into his arms. The baby is coming now." What followed was primal and terrifying, and beautiful beyond words. Marcus cleared the room of everyone but himself and Robert, standing guard at the door while the Alpha King delivered his own son by candlelight in an abandoned lodge, his hands steady, despite their trembling, his voice guiding Barbara through each push, each breath. When the baby finally emerged, crying lustily, perfectly formed, Robert caught his son in his hands and laid him on Barbara's chest, both of them weeping with relief and wonder. "I know," Robert said, his forehead pressed to Barbara's, his hand covering hers where it rested on their son's tiny back. "I know it was you. That night, it was always you. My memories were not of some ghost. They were of you, Barbara, my mate, my queen. The woman I have been searching for was here all along, and I was too blind to see what my soul already knew." His voice broke. "I love you. I have loved you since that first night, even when I could not remember, even when I did not understand. My body knew, my heart knew, and now, finally, so do I." Barbara looked up at him through tears, her hand coming up to cup his face. "I love you too," she whispered. "I have been so afraid to hope, so afraid that I was imagining. You imagined nothing." He kissed her softly, carefully, mindful of what she had just endured. "You are mine, and I am yours, and no one will ever threaten our family again." Chapter 9. 3 days after Edmund's dramatic entrance into the world, Robert stood before the assembled council and court, with his son cradled in one arm, and his other hand extended toward Barbara, who sat in a chair of honor beside the throne. She was pale still, recovering from both the kidnapping and the birth, but her spine was straight, and her eyes were clear. The grand hall was packed to capacity. Every noble family, every council member, every courtier who had whispered behind fans and cast judgment, all of them were present to witness what Robert had promised would be a revelation that would reshape the kingdom. "Bring them forward," Robert commanded, his voice carrying to the furthest corners of the hall. Guards dragged Elena, Elder Thomas, and Lord William into the center of the room, their hands bound, their faces reflecting varying degrees of defiance and terror. Behind them came a parade of bribed guards and complicit servants, the full scope of the conspiracy made visible. Marcus stepped forward, his voice steady as he recited the evidence he had meticulously gathered, the bribes, the forged messages, the testimony of servants who had been coerced but now spoke freely under royal protection. The plot was laid bare in all its ugliness. The plan to murder Barbara and her child, to install Elena as queen, to manipulate Robert's grief and fragmented memories for political gain. The crowd's whispers rose to a roar of shock and outrage, but Robert raised his hand for silence, and the hall quieted instantly. "There is more," he said, his eyes sweeping across the assembly. 8 months ago, at the Alpha Council gathering, both Lady Barbara and I were drugged with moonherbs by conspirators who sought to compromise us for their own purposes. What happened that night between us was not scandal. It was 2 victims finding each other in darkness, creating a connection neither of us could remember, but both of us felt. He turned to look at Barbara, and the love in his eyes was unmistakable. Lady Barbara is not some opportunist who trapped me into claiming her child. She is my true mate, the woman I have been searching for since that night. Edmund is my legitimate son, conceived in a moment of genuine connection that transcended the poison meant to destroy us both. Robert handed Edmund to Marcus and descended from the dais, moving to kneel before Barbara. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. The Alpha King, the most powerful man in the kingdom, on his knees before a woman they had all scorned. "Barbara," he said, his voice carrying despite its softness, "I offer you a choice that is truly yours to make. You can accept the crown and become my queen in every sense, my partner, my equal, the woman who will rule beside me and help shape this kingdom's future. Or, if you choose, you can take our son and leave with my full protection and support, free to build whatever life you wish, wherever you wish. The choice is yours alone, with no obligation, no debt, no expectation. You owe me nothing, but I hope," his voice caught, "I hope you will choose to stay." The hall held its collective breath. Barbara looked down at this warrior king who had saved her, who had claimed her when she had nothing, who had ridden through the night to find her, who now offered her not just a crown, but genuine choice, the thing no one had given her in months. She stood slowly, her hand reaching to cup his face, tilting it up so she could meet his eyes. "I spent months believing I was broken," she said, her voice clear and strong. "That what was done to me had somehow diminished my worth. I carried shame that was never mine to bear, accepted judgment I never deserved, and believed I was unworthy of love or respect." She paused, her thumb tracing the scar along his jaw. "But I am not broken. I am not diminished. I am not unworthy. What happened to me does not define me. Who I choose to be defines me. And I choose to be your queen. Not because you saved me, not because I have nowhere else to go, but because I love you, and because I have the strength to stand beside you as an equal and help you build a kingdom that values truth over appearance, substance over scandal." Robert stood, pulling her close, carefully, mindful of her still healing body, and kissed her while the hall erupted in applause that was equal parts genuine joy and political necessity. The coronation that followed was unlike any the kingdom had witnessed. Barbara stood before the assembled nobles in a gown of white and gold, her dark hair crowned with a circlet that caught the light streaming through the stained glass windows. She was no longer the dishonored woman no one wanted, but a queen claiming her rightful place, not as a rescued victim, but as a woman who had survived darkness and chosen to step into the light. As for the conspirators, Justice was swift and public. Elena, Thomas, and William were stripped of their titles and banished to the furthest reaches of the kingdom, their names forever associated with treachery and shame. Later, when the crowds had dispersed and the regalia had been carefully stored away, Robert and Barbara sat together in their chambers, with Edmund nursing contentedly between them. The castle was finally quiet, the political machinations temporarily stilled, the judgment and whispers replaced with cautious respect. "Do you ever regret it?" Barbara asked softly, her finger tracing Edmund's tiny hand. "That night, the way we began." Robert's arm tightened around her shoulders. "I regret that we suffered. I regret the pain and the confusion and the months we lost. But I do not regret you, Barbara. I could never regret you." She leaned into him, finally allowing herself to believe in the sanctuary they had built together, not through political arrangement or convenient fiction, but through choice and courage and love that had survived every attempt to destroy it. Edmund made a small sound of contentment, already asleep, his face peaceful in the way only infants can achieve. Robert and Barbara sat watching him in the candlelight, two people who had found each other in darkness and chosen to walk into the light together, carrying with them a son who represented not scandal, but hope, the heir born of truth, protected by love, and destined to inherit a kingdom that had finally learned to value what truly mattered. If you loved Barbara and Robert's journey from disgrace to destiny, from shame to sovereignty, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of fierce heroines who refuse to be defined by their circumstances, and warrior kings who learn that true strength means choosing love over duty, truth over appearance, and partnership over power. Next time, a cursed princess, a reluctant knight, and a prophecy that threatens to destroy them both. You won't want to miss it.